Triggered! Have you been triggered? Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because triggering is this sometimes a subject of ridicule from some sections of society, or particularly from this sort of online ecology or ecosystem. I have some experience and understanding of triggering because I'm a person in recovery. So in our world, people in recovery, you would be triggered or provoked or activated by going into an environment that's likely to trigger your addiction. Me, I can't be around, basically anything, drugs, sex, pornography, because I recognise that in this context is a triggering not of I feel all weak and like oppressed and afraid, is that I feel like activated. So the triggering could create numerous responses. Indeed, how would we know the nature of another person's response, whether it's a passive or active response or not, other than from the subsequent behaviour? But I suspect and would suggest that what we mean by triggering is that the actions, words of another create an emotional state in us that we prefer not to have. I prefer not to be put into a mental space where I'm not, in my language, and this is where spirituality becomes very, very helpful, connected to God. What this means is I'm in a state of presence, that I'm not looking to be validated externally, not expecting to be taken care of externally. I'm not fearful and I'm not ashamed. If you want to avoid feeling triggered, perhaps by people's language or by your own fears or sense of inferiority that's come about as a result of your own negative programming, which at some point would have been external or at least brought out by external factors, then perhaps consider some of these tips and ideas. As a drug addict, I don't go to environments where I'm likely to encounter drugs and alcohol. I'm responsible. I've fully accepted that I don't drink or take drugs. As a person that doesn't want to look at pornography or be involved in the commodification or objectification of human beings, I am aware. That's a harder thing to avoid because you might watch films or content that has objectification or erotica in it. In these moments, I have to become very, very present. Normally when I think about triggering and the way it's used, say, in culture war context, is like, oh no, I've been triggered because it's like a patriarchal figure saying something, or it's some racist language or whatever. In these instances, I suppose I am living in a white man body. How I would extrapolate these tools that apply, that I have learned from addiction in this new context, is where possible not engaging. And I suppose that does lead to sort of that no platforming idea that to some degree I query, because on a political level I think that conversation is important, contact between diverse groups is important. However, I don't think it is good for people that have been traumatized or hurt to re-engage or reactivate that trauma. A therapist of mine once said that an exercise that I undertook in a treatment center once re-traumatized me. I had to write down a load of biographical detail about stuff that happened to me in relationships that I'd had as a child. And he said that in his opinion as a therapist, when I discussed it years later, he said, you've been re-traumatized. Now that is re-triggered. That these therapeutic exercises where I had to write down stuff that had happened when I was a child led me to have a bit of a violent outburst, and no other people were involved. I sort of smashed up some furniture and stuff in a treatment centre and had to be taken to be evaluated externally. This is 20 odd years ago. So I understand this stuff. I understand how trauma can be reactivated. Now, how I would avoid it now is I continue to work on myself. I continue to work on valuing myself and recognising that if you have enough self-esteem, you are no longer dependent on external resources for self-sustenance, and a accompaniment to that is that you are not so easily triggered. One of the things I've recognised in my ongoing journey of personal growth is how much power I've left outside of myself. Like if a male makes me feel intimidated, or in my case here, as a heterosexual person, say, if a female makes me feel like I'm attractive and important, how that will sort of almost hormonally, chemically change me. What is this trigger and what are we talking about? We're talking about some influx of adrenaline or some influx of dopamine or serotonin or cortisol, like, sort of positive or negative hormones. But that, indeed, these are triggered by a sort of a psychic state, by an external coordinate. Now, what I try to do is work on, like, say, for example, around sex, I've done a great deal of work on recognizing that I can gain nothing from losing contact with who I really am. And who I really am means being faithful and truthful and honourable in all relationships. This is a very difficult thing to maintain perfectly, but having such a high standard does mean that I will never do anything as catastrophic as be unfaithful or as morally out of alignment with who I want to be, as objectifying a person or talking to somebody, please God, in an inappropriate way. With regard to like my commitment to be abstinent, say, I don't go near environments where there's going to be drugs and alcohol. I think it's, in a sense, we ought to focus first on positive behaviours and positive outcomes. What environments do you not only not feel triggered in? What relationships do you not only not feel triggered in, but feel nurtured in, feel better? This is where we must bring our focus and our attention. This triggering isn't something that's necessarily only going to happen online or in an educational environment. It's more likely to happen in relationship with human beings that we actually know. This is the reality of our lives. The reality of our lives is not in abstract on this phone, on your laptop, interacting with culture, a culture that primarily operates as a kind of a platform for commodification and for selling products. That is the engine, the motor of our culture. Money, or to put it into a very succinct idiom, money makes the world go round. We're living in a material world and I'm a material girl. So in order to not be triggered, look at what your relationship is with culture and be careful about the culture that you consume. Minimalize it, simplify it. Look at the relationships you have in your life. If there are relationships that continually make you feel triggered, that triggering I would suggest to you is an information that you're in a relationship that is negative. I would cultivate positive practices. I would cultivate meditation. Meditation is a very healing thing, very healing way of getting beneath the layers of accumulated trauma, feeling the sadness, processing it and moving beyond it so that you are not continually susceptible to these feelings of being triggered. I'm able to do things and go into environments and engage in behaviours that I wouldn't have been able to some time ago. I'm not a cosseted little person that can't cope with the real world. I spend a lot of time with people in early recovery. I spend a lot of time with people that have been in sort of traumatised situations, and I'm able to, God willing, cope with that pretty well because I suppose I'm in a position of service. And I guess the ultimate solution to all of these things is not to overly identify with the person you believe yourself to be, the construct. The reason now that I can talk about, deal with my childhood differently, more successfully, is because I recognise I am no longer that child. I've progressed beyond it. I'm not only a father to my children, I'm a father to the child that I once was. I'm not looking externally for that. I'm not looking externally for nurture. Of course, I have areas of my life where I rely on other people, but I try not to be codependent on other people. If you want to avoid being triggered, even though you oughtn't be ashamed of it because it's just information, it's just an acknowledgement that you have suffered pain and you have suffered trauma, then become aware and conscious of where you're experiencing this triggering. Look at which areas of your life you really need to maintain, which of these relationships you actually need to continue, and do the deep, necessary work of self-nurture that will mean that you feel incubated and safe, that you feel nurtured and held, that you can go into different environments. Not that you would needlessly and wantonly wander into environments in which you think you are going to be hurt, but that you feel like when you go through this world that you are safe, that you are protected, simply because you are no longer that delicate construct, that fragile construct that you once believed yourself to be, but that you have limitless power to serve, limitless power to love others, not limitless power to build up a fragile ego. That will always ultimately be destroyed. Part of what the triggering teaches us is that we've become overly reliant on a not superficial, but constructed artificial identity, an identity that no longer serves us.